Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast, where we discuss the philosophy and skills of lightweight backcountry travel so you can experience the outdoors with more comfort, safety, and enjoyment.
Look for me in the mountains, where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
I'm Andrew Marshall, and today's podcast is a conversation with journalist Adam Federman, whose piece, How Science Got Trampled in the Rush to Drill in the Arctic, recently appeared in Politico magazine. Adam is a reporting fellow with Type Investigations, where he writes about energy, public land, and the Trump administration's environmental policies. Type Investigations is an outlet that commissions investigative journalism from independent journalists in partnership with major media outlets like the New York Times Magazine, Smithsonian Magazine, Vice, Harper's, The Nation, Mother Jones, ABC News, NBC News, NPR, PBS, and lots of other cool places. So we came across Adam's piece shortly after it was published in July, and since then the story has continued to develop. So today we're excited to sit down with Adam to talk about his article and America's evolving relationship with public land. Adam, thanks so much for making the time for us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start out very basic. Your piece centers around the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which has been in the news a lot basically since the 80s. But just to catch everybody up, what is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? How did it come to be, and why is it important?
Yeah, it's one of these iconic American landscapes. And even though most of us will probably never visit, the majority of Americans are aware of this place out there. And part of the reason for that is that it's the largest wildlife sanctuary in the United States, 19.3 million acres. It's a little bit hard to wrap your head around the scope and scale of the ecology of the place. And as you mentioned, it's been contested since it was created in 1980 through legislation signed by Jimmy Carter, which essentially established the refuge and also included a provision which left up to Congress the fate of what is known as the coastal plain. And that's a 1.5 million acre expanse along the Arctic Sea that is believed to contain, large deposits of oil and gas. So it's been this iconic symbolic landscape beloved by the conservation community, but one that's also been sought after by industry and Republicans in Congress.
So that provision to leave up to Congress the fate of the coastline, was that just a compromise that Carter had to do in order to get the refuge established?
It was very much a compromise. And in fact, the legislation was signed after Carter had lost the election. He was a lame duck. He had very little power left. In House versions of the bill, the entire refuge was protected, but Ted Stevens, Alaska rep in the Senate, included this provision that left up to Congress essentially the fate of the coastal plain. And in the 1980s, the Fish and Wildlife Service conducted a number of environmental studies to sort of evaluate the resources and also the oil and gas reserves in the refuge. And from that moment on, Congress has debated whether to open up the coastal plain, and in many cases got very close to doing that.
We know that it's big, and we know that it's iconic and scenic, but why is it important ecologically? And then also, what is it that's so attractive to the mining interests at the moment?
Well, ecologically, it's probably the most biologically diverse region in the Arctic. It spans 6 different ecological zones. You've got, tundra along the coast, the Brooks Range, boreal forests, the whole sort of a mix is included in this refuge, in addition to a number of unique species, some of which are threatened and endangered. And then I also think there's just this idea of a place that's been protected, for as long as the refuge has, and that encompasses this kind of scale and species diversity. We don't have that many places like this left. So its significance is elevated. But at the same time, Alaska's North Slope is famous for its oil and gas deposits, and I think it's also important to point out that though the refuge is protected, it's surrounded by oil and gas development, and is really just a tiny fraction of the North Slope that remains undeveloped. So you've got Prudhoe Bay, to the west, and state land that's been developed, and also the federally owned National Petroleum Reserve has also been heavily developed, and the Trump administration is pushing to actually open up even more of that. So within that context, industry has been interested in figuring out, well, what kind of reserves are underneath the refuge, and can we exploit them?
Okay, so let's get into actually why we're talking about this right now. Let's go back to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and how a provision kind of got inserted into that bill that is trying to open up the refuge.
I mean, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, signed in December 2017, is one of the few pieces of legislation that the Trump administration has actually been able to get over the finish line. And it was a huge giveaway to corporations and the wealthy, but it also included a two-page provision opening up the wildlife refuge to oil and gas development. And the rationale was that the lease sales that would ensue would generate a certain amount of revenue for the Treasury. I think the estimate was something like $1.8 billion over the course of 10 years or something like that. Many have criticized that estimate and say that, based on current oil prices and other lease sales that have taken place in Alaska, the Treasury will actually generate far less than that. But the bottom line is that the bill opened up the refuge and set in motion this process, the environmental review process, which the Department of the Interior had to undertake before it can actually hold a lease sale, which it has said it hopes to do by the end of this year, in the next few months.
Right, and we will get into the review process here in a few minutes, because that is kind of the thrust of your article and what we're going to spend some time talking about today. But just for the political junkies amongst us, I think it's interesting to point out that if you've been paying attention for the last few years, you know that the math in the Senate, and in particular, is pretty tight to get legislation passed. And it was Lisa Murkowski. Is she the junior senator from Alaska or the senior senator?
She's now the senior senator.
She's now the senior senator. So the Lisa Murkowski, the senior senator of Alaska, is the one who obviously put this provision in. But what's the history? I mean, they've been trying to open it up for a while, right?
Indeed. Well, and of course, Lisa Murkowski's father, Frank Murkowski, was one of the big proponents of opening up the refuge, and had pushed similar legislation during the George W. Bush administration. And many feel that this is, one of the great achievements for Murkowski, and her vote was crucial on that bill, on the tax bill. You may remember that she was one of the votes that sabotaged the Republicans' attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So,
right,
lining this up was key, and obviously, this Republican Congress seems to have no qualms about opening up the wildlife refuge. But in the past, there have been moderate Republicans who have resisted that push. So I guess the bottom line is that the stars were aligned, with this administration. And in fact, I know through my reporting that opening up the refuge was high on the list of things to do from the very beginning of the Trump presidency. And then Secretary Zinke, I think his first trip outside of D.C. was to Alaska with Murkowski, and he talked about the path to energy dominance running through the state of Alaska, and obviously opening up the refuge is considered a key part of that.
Drilling and mining has been going on in Alaska for decades. Obviously, you mentioned the North Slope of Alaska is fairly famous for the resources, but that the process is that it happens after an environmental review. So can you just kind of walk us through what's the purpose of an environmental review, who conducts these reviews, and that way we'll have an idea of what we're contrasting with when we get into how this current review actually happened.
So the National Environmental Policy Act, which was established in 1970, essentially requires the federal government to conduct environmental reviews for proposed development on federal land. It can be any kind of development project. It can be environmental reviews carried out by the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineer or Department of the Interior. In this case, we're talking about federal land administered by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So that falls under the jurisdiction of Department of the Interior. And in order to have a lease sale, the department is required to conduct an environmental impact statement, which evaluates potential impacts of oil and gas leasing on the entire coastal plain. So it's a hugely ambitious, complicated document that involves scientists throughout the department and independent contractors. So in the course of reporting this story, I talked to a number of former DOI officials who had served there under the Obama administration, and they all said that an environmental review process for a landscape like the Arctic Wildlife Refuge would normally take anywhere between 2 and more likely 3 years, and this administration has completed their review in under 18 months. So a number of conservation groups have criticized the speed with which the department has conducted the review and argue that the final document is deeply flawed as a result of that.
What are some of the ramifications that we could possibly see from a speedy or incomplete review?
I think we're already, in a sense, seeing them. The department actually released the final EIS just before we spoke, and they've chosen the most expansive development plan. The department has a number of alternatives they can choose between. They've chosen one that opens up virtually the entire coastal plain and that has the least restrictions for oil and gas development. So, it's important to point out that this EIS initiates the lease sales. So, oil companies will bid on leases within the coastal plain, and then begin the process of developing the region, which means building roads, landing strips, and everything else that goes along with oil and gas development. So the impacts are far-reaching, and if you don't have proper restrictions in place in the beginning and environmental safeguards to protect, for example, polar bears, which are threatened and whose numbers have declined by nearly 50% in the last 10 years, then you risk potentially doing even greater damage to an ecosystem that already faces some pretty serious threats, primarily from changing climate.
So one of the wildest things about your piece was these allegations from career scientists who told you that their findings were omitted or in some cases just completely altered in the final study. Can you go into some of the details that you uncovered there?
Yeah, it is pretty shocking. And at the outset, it's important to point out that, and this is somewhat complicated, so I apologize for all the discussion of environmental reviews, but there are actually 2 different review processes taking place. One is for the oil and gas leasing, and the other is for seismic surveys of the coastal plain, which are done to evaluate the oil and gas reserves. And the department has been pushing to get both of these accomplished in a very short period of time. So my story dealt primarily with changes made to findings reached by career scientists who were writing up some of the analyses for the impact statement looking at seismic surveys. And it is shocking. What I found is that the department had, without even informing career BLM scientists, had altered conclusions reached regarding impacts to polar bears and impacts on native communities, introduced fundamental inaccuracies and errors into the text and moved things around in ways that completely distorted, what these seasoned veterans who do these things all the time. And these are BLM guys. I think there's been some discussion out there that Fish and Wildlife Service employees are somewhat more resistant to developing the refuge, and there may be some truth to that. But BLM is an agency that manages oil and gas development, and they do these kinds of assessments all the time. So to see that the department had actually modified conclusions reached by their own BLM staff is really disturbing, and I think should really raise some very serious questions about this entire process, as it moves forward.
Yeah, it's super disturbing. And then when you reached out to the Department of the Interior for a statement on this, what did they say back to you?
Yeah, it was pretty pro forma. I mean, they offered statements from the BLM Alaska state director just saying that they had seen no evidence of efforts to suppress science or in any way interfere with the work of their career scientists, et cetera. And they offered a similar statement from the regional director of the Alaska Fish and Wildlife Service. But they didn't offer much more than that. They didn't respond to specific questions about how the changes had been introduced, who specifically authorized them. And that's really what I wanted to get at in this story, because, it's clear that getting this lease sale done is one of the highest priorities, both of the Department of the Interior and the Trump administration. And we know from reporting, both that I've done and that others have done, that high-level officials at the department, including Joe Balash, who recently resigned and has now gone on to work for an oil company that may have interests in the refuge eventually. We know that Balash and David Bernhardt, who is now Secretary of the Interior, have taken a very personal interest in seeing this through. So the big question is whether they were aware of these changes, and if and how they responded to them. In my questions to DOI, I asked specifically if Bernhardt had been aware of these changes, if he had reviewed the environmental assessment, and they said no. In the case of Joe Balash, they wouldn't give me a yes or no response, and offered some sort of legal explanation about the fact that they couldn't comment on the document before it was made public. So I have some questions about Balash's role in this. He was meeting with DOI solicitors in Alaska just before the document was set to be published, and sort of during the time frame that these changes were being made. So there are a lot of unanswered questions still, and I think that Congress has a role in this to seek more information and to provide that information to the public before a lease sale or before any kind of seismic activity takes place.
Sure, and you're right. It is complicated, but the specifics matter here. And it's I think it's one of the reasons that sometimes this stuff can fly under the radar, because it can be difficult for the layman, even someone who's interested in the outdoors, to understand, which agency is managing which land and what they're responsible for. So with the refuge, we have the BLM and Fish and Wildlife, right?
Indeed, and primarily Fish and Wildlife has been the agency responsible for managing the refuge. It's a wildlife refuge. It's been under Fish and Wildlife Service jurisdiction since it was created in 1980. But under the Tax Act, the authority to oversee the oil and gas leasing program was, turned over to BLM and specifically to, the Secretary of the Interior acting, through BLM. So the language in the Tax Act was very, very deliberate in its framing, and in order to sort of make sure that Fish and Wildlife Service did not, pose any obstacles to getting this thing done.
This would not be the first time that research about the refuge was altered or omitted. There's a section in your article where you talk about some things that happened post 9/11. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this was an interesting and somewhat notorious episode, and it actually involved Lisa Murkowski's father, he wasn't responsible for the manipulations, but as a senator at that time, post 9/11, there was a push to open up the refuge. The Bush administration was very much in favor of that. Gail Norton was Interior Secretary at the time. And in fact, David Bernhardt was also at the department. And Murkowski requested some information on the refuge and specifically wanted to know what kind of impacts to the porcupine caribou herd could be expected if oil and gas development were to take place. And basically, Fish and Wildlife Service scientists at the refuge drafted some of those responses, and they made their way up the chain. And when they were released to Murkowski's office, they'd been substantially modified. And similar to the kinds of things that I found in my story that have recently happened, conclusions about the impacts of oil and gas development on the porcupine caribou herd were reversed. And ultimately, that information was leaked to the Washington Post. And Bernhardt, in fact, was directly implicated in possibly having made some of those alterations. And this is one example. That there have been even earlier examples from the 1980s of information and research being suppressed in order to, advance the interests of the oil and gas industry.
So Bernhardt was Ryan Zinke's Deputy Secretary of the Interior. And during his confirmation hearing for that role, did any of this come up?
It did come up. I mean, the organization Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, PEER, they had initially published these documents back in 2001, 2002, and they actually published them again and included a description of what had happened and Bernhardt's role in it, and urged Congress to challenge him and to ask him about how this had transpired. So, in some of the written testimony, he did respond to a question about what had happened at that time, but really provided no new information. But Bernhardt has a long, beyond just serving in the Bush administration and sort of overseeing this episode involving the caribou research, as an attorney in private practice in 2013, 2014, actually represented the state of Alaska in a lawsuit against the Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of the Interior to try to get them to allow the state to conduct seismic surveys of the refuge. And at the time, Joe Belash was commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources, working closely with Bernhardt to sort of get this done. And ultimately they failed and lost that case. But, here they are back together at the top of DOI and, bringing to fruition something that's been, a long-held dream of Republican senators and in particular the Alaska delegation.
Yeah, and it certainly matches the fox guarding the hen house pattern of almost every Trump administration appointment. This speaks a little bit to a larger conversation about public lands outside of the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. But in your reporting or in the reporting of some of your colleagues, have you noticed that pattern of sort of like the people who should be in charge of protecting these places actually have a vested interest in maybe going the other direction with them?
Without a doubt. I think it's a perennial problem in the Trump administration, and we see it at DOI, in a major way. I mean, the acting head of the Bureau of Land Management at the moment is a fellow who has advocated in the past for, transferring federal land to private interests of the state. Now he says he sort of disavows that, but the fact is that you've got a number of figures in top leadership positions who have either, worked on behalf of a private industry, whether it's the oil and gas industry or mining industry, or who have, advocated positions that are essentially at odds with the mission of the Bureau of Land Management and the department at large.
I remember maybe about a year ago, there were a lot of stories in the news about a kind of a brain drain happening, particularly in the Department of State. And I'm curious if in your reporting you've noticed similar things happening in Department of the Interior, and maybe what the culture is like there right now.
Yeah, it's a great question. You're absolutely right. And it's something that really hasn't been reported on at Department of the Interior, but whenever I speak to people at the department, they talk about the fact that people are leaving all the time. Sometimes they're being forced out in some cases. In others, they're just throwing up their hands and saying that they've had enough, and they're taking early retirement or finding, some other kind of work. And in the meantime, your listeners may be following BLM's decision to relocate its headquarters out to Colorado, which many feel is an attempt to kind of undermine the agency. So it's definitely a challenging time to be there at the department. To put it mildly, I think a lot of scientists and career folks are under an enormous amount of pressure to do their jobs. I didn't focus on this in my story, but the culture of fear and intimidation that has pervaded the Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska, over what's happening with the refuge is really eye-opening. People really can't speak about the refuge at all. One employee actually told me that they felt they couldn't even talk about it with their coworkers. The sense of intimidation was so great. So yeah, things have gotten under Bernhardt. Things have only gotten worse.
Yeah, you mentioned in your article even you had trouble getting former employees to go on the record because they didn't want to compromise the jobs of their colleagues who still had work there in the department.
That's right. It's a very delicate balance. I think that particularly in the case of the Fish and Wildlife Service, which, although it has been marginalized, still is able to raise important questions about the impacts of development in this environmental review process. And I think that some former employees feel that if they were to speak openly about what's either what's happening there or what they think is happening, they could potentially jeopardize careers of current employees.
And just to be clear, we're talking about career scientists who have served under multiple administrations, Republican and Democrat. Like these are people there to do science. They don't necessarily have a political agenda. Is that right?
Absolutely. In my experience covering the department over the last 3 years, most of these folks have worked for Republican and Democratic administrations, and they have no problem, doing either, as long as they understand what their mandate is, and as long as they know that their work will be respected and taken seriously. And that's what's missing with this administration, that they don't trust or respect the work of career folks. And working in that environment is extremely difficult. One of the first actions undertaken by the department was to relocate a number of senior executive service employees without any advance notice, which I think caught a lot of people off guard and was really seen as a way of sort of indicating who was in charge, and that sort of set the tone from the very beginning, and that's really continued up to the present.
Yeah, I was going to ask why relocating the BLM offices would be viewed as an undermining of that department, but now I think I understand you're saying that like you're giving career people, you either say, hey, uproot your life or find another job.
Exactly, which is not easy. First of all, it should be said that this is not the first time that the idea of relocating BLM or other parts of the department to the west has been floated. And there are some, I think, perfectly valid arguments in favor of doing so in some fashion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But this administration has, sort of burned through any kind of trust it may have had on that matter. So the motives are questionable. And what you just said is very much the case, that these are career folks who have for the most part, been in Washington for years. To uproot and move to Grand Junction, Colorado, is a big deal. So I think the understanding is that a number of employees will decide not to take the offer and will simply resign or retire.
Yeah, and no offense to anyone who lives in Grand Junction, but it's very different than Washington, D.C., if you've ever been there.
And there are a lot of questions about why they chose Grand Junction. David Bernhardt, native of Rifle, Colorado, and the process for choosing this particular location, it's why they didn't, for example, go with Denver, where there already are a large number of Interior Department employees, et cetera. So a lot of questions on that front. And, that's going to be one of Bernhardt's, legacies, probably, is if he's able to move this forward, is relocating the BLM out to Colorado.
Well, let's talk about legacy a little bit. I don't want to ask you to editorialize too much, but, this is kind of your beat, and this has been what you've been writing about since Trump took office. So based on your research and the people you've talked to and your expertise, what do you see as the legacy of the Trump administration in regards to public lands?
For starters, it's been an aggressive and in many ways successful attempt to strip away rules and regulations that govern oil and gas development on federal land and offshore waters. I mean, across the board, they've reversed or tried to repeal, just about every Obama administration rule and regulation that was attempting to address oil and gas development on public land, whether it was capturing methane, offshore rules designed to strengthen, protections in the wake of the, BP disaster. So aggressive regulatory rollback, and then at the same time, maximizing the amount of public land that's on the auction block. I mean, even though a number of these lease sales have been relatively lackluster, the department continues to just attempt to auction off as much acreage as they possibly can. So, they in the early days, one of the DOI political appointees said that the department is now open for business, and I mean that's really been their mantra. And I imagine that there are a lot of stories related to conflict of interest and sort of giving favors to particular companies and interests that will only come to the light after the fact and when documents are made available. But we've got, huge stories related to, for example, uranium mining claims in Grand Canyon, or, with the monument reductions in Utah, what's going to happen to that land, et cetera. What's going on in Alaska, which is not just the wildlife refuge, but the National Petroleum Reserve and the Tongass National Forest, which the administration wants to open up to logging, et cetera. And you sort of take that model and replicate it across the American West, and we have a legacy of deregulation and development that I think is really in an age of catastrophic climate change is something that we should all be quite concerned about.
One question I have is, how much of this is reversible? How much of it changes if there's a Democrat holding the presidency? How much of it changes if Congress goes blue? And how much of it just can't be undone?
Well, it's a great question. A lot of it can be undone, and perhaps the saving grace of this administration is the fact that they've gone about things in a rather reckless way in order to get things done quickly, which means they haven't always followed the rules. So you've already seen the courts overturn some of the decisions that have been made, including the executive order to open up offshore drilling in the Arctic and elsewhere. That was overturned by a court in Alaska. And we've seen a number of other examples of this happening. So for now, anyway, the legal system is playing its part. And if Trump is ousted next year, then the next administration will have the opportunity to rehabilitate many of these rules and regulations. But one has to also keep in mind that part of what Bernhardt and others have done is they're hollowing out these federal agencies. I mean, that has been the Trump administration's Steve Bannon's project from the very beginning. The deconstruction of the administrative state, I think, was how Bannon put it. So you just talked about brain drain, and I think it's sometimes easy to forget how long it takes to build these institutions and organizations, and with a lot of resignations and people retiring and just morale being completely destroyed. How do you rebuild an agency like the U.S. Geological Survey, for example? How do you attract new talent, young talent, et cetera? I think that's going to be a big challenge, and one that certainly can't just be fixed by a change of administration.
What's the path towards breaking this cycle of increased regulations and then decreased regulations, and increased regulations and decreased regulations?
Yeah, it's I think one of the sort of incongruous things about this administration is that it has pursued doing away with some regulations that industry was actually perfectly okay with. The methane industry was sort of coming on board, at least some of the bigger players, and even with the offshore regulations that had been put in place after the BP spill. But it's part of the nature of American politics. I mean, we saw the same thing happen under George W. Bush. In fact, they were probably somewhat more skillful. I think this administration, its approach has been slash and burn, which in a sense will make it easier to undo some of what they've tried to accomplish. But regulations have to be strong, and they have to be enforced. BLM hasn't always enforced the rules and regulations on its books, so that's a big part of the equation. And obviously, with accelerating impacts of climate change, many of these questions are only going to become more urgent.
Let's shift gears just slightly. I wanted to ask you this earlier, but I forgot. So my question is on the tension in Native communities between the economic benefits of development versus the need to protect sacred or traditional spaces. You kind of witnessed that firsthand, didn't you?
Yeah, you definitely see it. Kaktovik tends to be, generally speaking, more in favor of oil and gas development. I mean, it is important to point out that it's a very small settlement. It's about 250 people. It is located within the boundaries of the wildlife refuge and is on the coastal plain, so it's in close proximity to where oil and gas development would take place. And roughly half of the town's residents and the native corporations, the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, have for years advocated in favor of basically controlling their own destiny and being able to develop their own resources. And then just outside the refuge, the Gwich'in communities have been staunchly opposed to any kind of development on the coastal plain. They rely on caribou, which migrate and calve on the coastal plain, and consider it a sacred place. So, feel that any kind of industrialization of the coastal plain will potentially undermine their way of life. Now, I think to some extent the conflict between native communities has been sort of overplayed and perhaps magnified by media. But it's certainly present, and you do see differences within different communities, and even along the North Slope, you've got areas where there's been a fair bit of development, and attitudes perhaps in those communities are somewhat different. But I think it's rarely is it sort of a black and white kind of thing. And just a couple of days ago, there was a floor debate in the House on a bill that would actually repeal the provision in the Tax Act opening up the refuge. And both sides were sort of using the native communities to make their arguments. And in the end, it's big oil that is going to have access to most of these resources. So it's important to keep that in mind.
So we've mentioned a few times, just to wrap up here, that this is a complicated issue, and I'm just wondering if you had any advice on what people could do to stay informed and kind of wade through all of this, what sometimes just reads as bureaucratic ease.
Well, on the refuge in particular, the documents are public. There's an opportunity now to comment on them one last time, and the conservation community, along with native groups, will be suing the department over its push to open the refuge. So it's by no means a done deal, and I think that the more pressure there is from the public, the greater potential there is for some kind of a decision by a court to possibly delay the lease sale until next year, or possibly even after the next election. And then, generally speaking, we talked a little bit about uh, some of the rules and regulations that this administration has repealed or reversed without really going through due process. So, these things can be rectified, and the more input and sort of scrutiny there is from the public, who of course are the ones who, in fact, own this land. The greater likelihood is that they'll be protected.
Great, yes. And we'll put a link to the public comment website in the show notes for people to find. Adam, thank you so much for your time and for your reporting on this issue. Where can people find you online?
They can go to my website, adamfederman.com, or find my work at Type Investigations.
Perfect. Adam, thanks again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Backpacking Light podcast, which is brought to you by backpackinglight.com. Backpackinglight.com has been providing information and education about lightweight wilderness travel since the year 2000. The Backpacking Light podcast is supported by subscription fees paid by our loyal website subscribers, and we are extremely grateful for your support. A backpackinglight.com subscription can save you time and money on your quest to lighten your pack weight, spend more time in the outdoors, and connect with a community of like-minded hikers. So, if you aren't yet a backpackinglight.com subscriber, please consider subscribing and gain access to over 1 million forum posts, 4 million words of original content, more than 2,000 articles, and access to our Wilderness Adventures trekking programs. You can subscribe online right now at backpackinglight.com/subscribe. If you have feedback, questions, or tips for our listeners, please share them via email at podcast@backpackinglight.com. You can download the show notes for this episode by visiting backpackinglight.com/podcast. This podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Please leave us a review. It really, really does help other people find the show. Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall. And if we can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Be well, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away